The narrator explains that at 30 years old, he never considered himself the type of person who would be easily frightened by being home alone. He lived in a mother-daughter style house with his sister, a place divided into two separate living spaces. His sister occupied the downstairs apartment while he stayed upstairs. Most nights, however, she was rarely around because she often spent time at her boyfriend's house. That meant the house frequently felt much larger and emptier than it actually was. On this particular night, he was completely alone. He spent the evening watching a horror movie in the dark. The layout of the upstairs made the experience even unsettling. His living room, dining room, and kitchen all blended together into one open space. And while he sat on the couch facing the television, a large portion of the room remained behind him. Every now and then, despite knowing there was no reason to be nervous, he found himself glancing over his shoulder. The movie ended, and eventually he laughed off his nerves, brushed his teeth, turned off every light in the house, and went to bed. A few hours later, sometime around 1 a.m, he suddenly woke up. At first, he couldn't understand why. The room was dark, and he was still half asleep. Then he heard it, a voice coming from downstairs. Not just any voice, but one he recognized immediately. It sounded exactly like his sister. The voice seemed to be calling out from somewhere below him. Still groggy and unable to think clearly, he assumed she must have come home unexpectedly. Maybe she needed something. Maybe she was arguing with her boyfriend. None of it seemed strange in that sleepy state. He climbed out of bed and stepped into the dark hallway. As he moved through the upstairs, he heard the voice again. This time, it sounded even clearer. He could make out his own name being called. Hearing that convinced him someone was definitely downstairs. He called back, asking what was wrong, but there was no direct response. He continued down the stairs, struggling to wake himself up fully. Everything felt slightly unreal, like he was moving through a dream. When he reached the lower level, he searched for a light switch. After fumbling around in the darkness, he finally found one in the kitchen and flipped it on. The room slowly filled with light. He expected to see his sister standing there waiting for him. Instead, the entire apartment was empty. There was no sign of her, no sign of her boyfriend, no sign of anyone at all. Confused, he checked the bedroom, the living room, and every area downstairs. Nothing. The place was completely deserted. His confusion quickly transformed into unease. Then, just as he was trying to make sense of what was happening, a loud sound suddenly came from his sister's bedroom. It sounded as though something had fallen onto the floor. The problem was that he had literally just checked that room seconds earlier. Fear instantly replaced curiosity. Without investigating further, he hurried back upstairs and locked himself in his room. He grabbed his phone and repeatedly tried to call his sister. She never answered. Alone in the darkness, he sat there replaying everything in his mind. The voice had sounded real. It hadn't sounded distant or imagined. It had sounded exactly like his sister standing downstairs calling for him. The next morning, he woke up to a text message from her asking why he had called in the middle of the night. When he asked where she had been, her answer made his stomach drop. She told him she had spent the entire night at her boyfriend's house and never returned home. Hoping for a logical explanation, he went downstairs to search for whatever had supposedly fallen in the bedroom. Yet there was nothing on the floor, nothing out of place, nothing that could have created the noise he had heard. To this day, he tells himself he must have imagined everything. Maybe he had been half asleep. Maybe his mind created the sounds while he was waking up. But the problem with that explanation is how real it all felt. He had never experienced hallucinations before. He had no history of sleep disorders. The voice sounded perfect, and the noise in the bedroom seemed impossible to dismiss. That uncertainty is what stayed with him long after the night ended, because if it wasn't a hallucination, then something else was in that house calling him downstairs. The narrator explains that this experience happened when he was only 14 years old, at an age when being left home alone felt exciting rather than frightening. His mother worked long overnight shifts, and on this particular weekend night, he had invited a girl named Molly over to spend some time with him. They watched movies, talked for hours, and enjoyed what felt like a completely normal evening. Eventually, Molly had to leave because her parents were strict about curfews. Once she was gone, he found himself alone in the house, with several hours still left before his mother would return home. At first, nothing seemed unusual. He stayed in his bedroom upstairs, watching television and relaxing in bed. The house was quiet, and the night felt ordinary. Then he heard something outside. It was the sound of one of the deck chairs scraping across the wooden deck in the backyard. The noise immediately caught his attention because there was no reason for anyone to be out there. Curious rather than scared, he walked over to the window and looked down into the darkness below. Sitting on one of the deck chairs was a person. His first thought was that it might be Molly. She had only left a short time earlier, and perhaps she had forgotten something or wanted to say goodbye. Feeling relieved by that possibility, he called out her name. The figure slowly looked up toward the window. The moment their eyes met, he realized it wasn't Molly. The person sitting in the chair was a man he had never seen before. The darkness hid many of his features, but there was no mistaking that he was a complete stranger. Instantly, a wave of fear hit him. He stepped away from the window so quickly that he nearly stumbled. His heart began racing as questions flooded his mind. Who was this man? Why was he sitting in his backyard? And how long had he been watching the house? Trying to convince himself there had to be some reasonable explanation, he messaged several friends. Maybe one of them was playing a prank. Yet every response came back the same. None of them knew what he was talking about. None of them were anywhere near his house. That answer only made the situation worse. After several minutes, curiosity got the better of him. He carefully approached the window again and looked outside. The man was still there. Not only was he still there, but he was staring directly at the bedroom window as though he had never taken his eyes off it. There was something deeply unsettling about that. Most people would have left after being spotted. This man seemed perfectly content to sit there in silence, watching. The narrator describes retreating from the window once more and turning off every source of light in the room. He climbed into bed and curled up, hoping the darkness would make it seem as though nobody was home. Even the glow from his phone felt dangerous. He worried that if the stranger saw any sign of movement, it might encourage him to stay. Minutes dragged by. Every second felt longer than the last. Eventually, he convinced himself that enough time had passed. Surely the man had grown bored and left. Gathering every bit of courage he had, he returned to the window for another look. His stomach immediately dropped. The man was still sitting there. Worse yet, he was still looking directly at the same window. Feeling trapped between fear and desperation, the narrator finally called down to him and asked what he wanted. The response was unlike anything he expected. His shoulders began moving up and down as though he were laughing, yet there was almost no sound. Instead, a strange wheezing whistle drifted through the night air, as if the man found the entire situation amusing. The narrator begged him to leave. Once again, he moved away from the window and tried to convince himself the encounter was over. Then he heard a new sound. The back door was being pushed. The stranger was trying to get inside. Panic took completely. He ran from the hallway back into his bedroom and hid. A few moments later, he heard movement at the front door as well. The stranger was checking every possible way into the house. Fortunately, the doors were locked.
After several failed attempts, the sounds finally stopped. The rest of the night felt endless. He remained hidden until morning, too frightened to move. Looking back as an adult, he still struggles to understand why he never called the police. At 14 years old, fear had clouded his judgment. All he could think about was staying quiet and hoping the stranger would leave. When his mother finally returned home, he told her everything. Instead of simply being shocked, she was furious that he never called for help. In hindsight, he agrees with her, but at the time, he was just a terrified teenager facing a situation he had never imagined. Even years later, one thought still haunts him. If those doors had been unlocked that night, the story might have ended very differently. The stranger wasn't wandering through the neighborhood by accident. He wasn't lost. He sat outside that bedroom window for a reason, and whatever that reason was, the narrator is grateful he never found out.
The narrator explains that this terrifying experience happened when he was only 10 years old. At the time, he lived in a busy household with his parents, his older brother, and his younger sister. It started as what seemed to be a normal Friday night. He was in his bedroom playing a Star Wars video game while his brother was out with friends. Nothing felt unusual until a phone call suddenly changed the mood of the entire house. From his room, he could hear his mother becoming emotional. Her voice quickly shifted from concern to panic, and before long, she was crying. Alarmed, he left his room to find out what was happening. That's when he learned that his older brother had been in a serious accident. A hospital had called his parents to inform them that his brother had been hit by a car. The news shook everyone. His mother was devastated, imagining the worst possible outcome. His father, while clearly worried, tried to stay calm and reassure her that everything would be okay. The narrator remembers feeling scared but also confused. He didn't know the full extent of the injuries. All he knew was that the situation was serious enough for his parents to rush out of the house immediately. In the chaos of preparing to leave, his parents made a difficult decision. They took his younger sister with them, but asked if he would be okay staying home alone. Wanting to appear brave and independent, he said yes. Within minutes, they were gone. The house suddenly felt different. The familiar sounds of family conversations disappeared. The living room was empty. The hallways were silent. Despite being worried about his brother, he tried to distract himself by returning to his video game. For a couple of hours, it worked. He focused on the screen and convinced himself everything would be fine. As the night grew later, he finally turned off the game and climbed into bed with his handheld console. It was well past midnight. Eventually, while lying there in the darkness, he heard something that immediately caught his attention. The front door opened. His first reaction was relief. He assumed his parents had returned from the hospital. He waited to hear their voices. He expected to hear footsteps, conversation, or perhaps even his brother speaking, but none of those sounds came. The house remained strangely quiet. A few minutes passed, then a few more. Still nothing. The silence began to feel wrong. Unable to ignore the uneasy feeling building inside him, he quietly got out of bed and opened his bedroom door. He stepped into the upstairs hallway and slowly approached the railing overlooking the living room below. What he saw instantly froze him in place. Standing in the darkness of the living room were three tall figures. They weren't his parents. They weren't anyone he recognized. They were complete strangers. For a moment, fear overwhelmed him so completely that he couldn't move. His mind struggled to process what he was seeing.
3 unknown people were standing inside his house in the middle of the night while he was home alone. Survival instincts finally kicked in. He backed away as quietly as possible and returned to his bedroom. Every tiny sound suddenly felt dangerous. When he closed his bedroom door, he immediately regretted it. Even the soft click of the latch sounded incredibly loud in the silence. Convinced the intruders had heard it, he rushed toward his closet. Inside, he found a small hiding place behind boxes, bags, and piles of clothing. It wasn't perfect, but it was the best option he had. He crouched down, pulled himself as far back as possible, and waited. The next few minutes felt longer than any he had ever experienced. Then came the sound he had been dreading. His bedroom door opened. Someone had entered the room. The narrator remembers feeling certain that he was about to die. At 10 years old, he couldn't imagine any other outcome. He heard footsteps moving across the room. Whoever had entered seemed to be checking the bed first. There was the sound of blankets being moved, followed by silence. Then the footsteps moved closer, 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 until they stopped directly outside the closet. Everything went quiet. A few seconds later, the closet door slowly opened. The narrator held his breath. He didn't look up. He didn't move. He didn't even blink. The closet remained open for what felt like an eternity. In reality, it may have been 20 seconds, but to a terrified child, it felt much longer. Every second increased the feeling that he had already been discovered. Finally, the closet door closed. The footsteps retreated. Moments later, they left the room entirely. Only then did he allow himself to breathe again. Hours later, after remaining hidden and terrified, he finally heard his parents return home. He immediately ran downstairs and told them what had happened. The truth quickly became clear. The intruders had broken into the house. Because his parents had rushed out so quickly after receiving the hospital call, they had accidentally left the front door unlocked. The intruders had entered, stolen valuables, and left through the same entrance. The narrator has replayed one specific moment in his mind for years. The moment when the closet door opened. The moment when someone stood there silently for 20 seconds. He still wonders whether the intruder actually saw him hiding among the boxes and clothes. Maybe the darkness concealed him. Maybe the burglar simply wasn't looking carefully. Or maybe the man saw a frightened 10-year-old child and decided not to hurt him. The truth is something he'll never know. What he does know is that he came frighteningly close to being discovered by strangers in his own home. And decades later, that memory remains one of the most terrifying experiences of his entire life.
The narrator explains that while playing basketball outside his parents' house, he looked up and saw an unfamiliar woman standing at an upstairs window. The moment she realized she had been spotted, she disappeared. Certain that someone had entered the house, he rushed inside and searched every room, closet, and even the basement, but found nothing. A neighbor later helped him search again, yet the woman seemed to have vanished completely. Assuming she had slipped out unnoticed, he locked the doors and tried to move on. That night, however, as he lay in bed, struggling to fall asleep, he heard movement nearby. When he turned over, he was horrified to see the same woman crawling out from underneath his bed. Acting on pure instinct, he jumped on her and managed to hold her down while she fought back. Fortunately, a neighbor arrived moments later and helped restrain her until police arrived. Officers later revealed they already knew who she was due to previous incidents. The realization that she had remained hidden inside the house for hours was what disturbed him the most, and it remains one of the most terrifying experiences of his life. The narrator explains that he was home alone for an entire week while his parents were away on vacation. One summer night, he was relaxing on the deck behind his house, listening to music and enjoying the quiet. Suddenly, he heard a man's voice coming from the woods. At first, he assumed he was imagining it, but the voice called out again, saying it needed help. Concerned, he responded and was told that someone was stuck in the woods directly in front of him. As he cautiously walked toward the tree line, he began asking questions. The stranger answered at first, but went silent when asked if anyone else was there. That silence immediately felt suspicious. Trusting his instincts, he backed away and returned to the house. Later, the same voice appeared much closer, this time somewhere in the backyard. The stranger claimed he could see him and eventually began pounding aggressively on a window while pretending to ask for help. Realizing it was likely a trap to lure him outside, the narrator locked himself inside and threatened to call the police. The man laughed and eventually disappeared into the darkness, leaving the narrator shaken by how close he came to following the stranger into the woods.